The dragon ships had burned their way across Europe for generations. But on the Guadalquivir in 844, the dragon met something it had never faced before. What happened next would end the Viking Age in Iberia before it truly began. They emerged from the morning fog like ghosts, 54 ships bearing sails the color of dried blood, cutting through the silver waters of the Guadalquivir. The people of Seville had never seen anything like them. Long, sleek vessels with carved dragon prows, packed with warriors whose reputation had already terrorized half of Europe. For decades, these Northmen had seemed unstoppable, a force of nature that descended without warning and vanished with the tide. From Lindisfarne to Paris, from Ireland to the Russian steppes, no fortress, no army, no prayer had proven sufficient to halt their advance. And now, on a warm September morning in 844, they had come for the jewel of Al-Andalus. What happened next would shatter assumptions held by both sides. It would expose the limits of Viking power and ignite a transformation that would reshape the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The Viking fleet had been probing the Atlantic coast for months, sailing from their base at Noirmoutier. Their first attempts to strike the Christian kingdom of Asturias had ended in disaster. Heavy losses at A Coruña, defeat at the hands of King Ramiro I. Undeterred, they continued south. Lisbon fell in late summer. The Vikings occupied the city for 13 days before pressing onward toward something greater. Seville, the wealthy heart of the Guadalquivir Valley, a city grown complacent in its inland position. The governor of Lisbon dispatched urgent messages to Córdoba. The Northmen were coming. But the Vikings moved faster than any warning. On September 25th, their fleet entered the Guadalquivir and began its ascent. These were men who had navigated the Seine to Paris, the rivers of Russia to the Caspian Sea. 100 kilometers of the Spanish River posed no obstacle. They established their base on Isla Menor and prepared their assault. Seville was wealthy, beautiful, and utterly unprepared. Unlike coastal cities expecting maritime threats, Seville had no substantial walls. Its citadel offered some protection, but the surrounding neighborhoods lay essentially open. On September 29th, local Muslim forces marched against the Viking camp. They were defeated. Within days, the Northmen had stormed the city. The chronicler Ibn Idari recorded that the Vikings subjected inhabitants to the terrors of imprisonment or death, and spared not even the beasts of burden. They looted homes, seized gold and silver, and took captives for slavery. They attempted to burn the great mosque, though in this they failed. Only the citadel held out, a lone fortress of resistance. For more than a week, the Vikings owned Seville. They had done what no enemy had accomplished since the Muslim conquest. But their triumph would prove fleeting. An army was gathering in Córdoba. When word reached Abd ar-Rahman II that Seville had fallen, he did something that distinguished the Muslim response from the paralysis gripping other European kingdoms. He acted. Within days, the emir mobilized forces under his chief minister, Isa ibn Shuhaid, summoning governors from across the emirate. Even Musa ibn Musa al-Qasi, a rival with his own political quarrels, set aside grievances to confront the common enemy. The army marched to Axarafe, a hill overlooking Seville, and began the methodical work of encirclement. Weeks of skirmishes followed, neither side forcing decisive engagement. But time favored the defenders. The Vikings were far from home, their supplies finite. The Muslims could wait. And they possessed something the Vikings had never encountered: fire that could not be extinguished. On November 11th, the Muslim forces struck. The Battle of Talyata would become one of the most decisive Viking defeats in the early medieval period. Andalusian cavalry swept against Norse positions, but the killing blow came from catapults loaded with naphtha, the petroleum-based incendiary the Greeks called liquid fire. The Muslims turned it against the wooden longships that were the Vikings' lifeline. Ship after ship burst into flame. Fire spread across the water, igniting sails, consuming hulls, trapping men between inferno and river. When the battle ended, between 500 and 1,000 Vikings lay dead. 30 longships had become charred wreckage. Survivors who fell into Muslim hands, perhaps 400 men, were publicly executed, hanged from palm trees as a warning. A handful were offered a choice: death or conversion. Some chose to live. According to one account, they settled in the Guadalquivir Valley and became cheese traders, Norse warriors turned dairy farmers. The remnants of the fleet, perhaps 20 ships, fled downriver under darkness. Their dreams of Iberian conquest had drowned in the Guadalquivir. Abd ar-Rahman II was not a man to let a crisis go to waste. In the following months, he launched a comprehensive military modernization. At Seville, he established a naval arsenal and commissioned a permanent fleet, the first standing navy in Andalusian history. He ordered walls built around vulnerable cities, established coastal watchtowers for early warning, and organized messenger systems to ensure intelligence traveled faster than any enemy. The chaos of 844 would never be repeated. When the Vikings returned 14 years later, they found an entirely different Al-Andalus waiting. The expedition of 859 was among the most ambitious in Viking history. 62 ships under the legendary Hastin and Bjorn Ironside departed the Loire with dreams of Mediterranean conquest. They never reached Seville. The newly constructed Andalusian navy intercepted them off Lisbon, forcing abandonment of plans for the Guadalquivir. Blocked from their objective, they diverted through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, raiding North Africa, southern France, and Italy. But when they attempted to return to the Atlantic, the Muslim fleet was waiting. Fire catapults destroyed more ships. The expedition that set out with 62 vessels returned with barely 20. The message was clear: Al-Andalus was no longer soft prey. The Viking defeat reveals truths that Romantic mythology obscures. Viking success depended on striking targets that could not resist. Monasteries with treasure and no soldiers, kingdoms torn by civil war. Their tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and avoiding organized opposition. When they encountered a centralized state with rapid mobilization, professional armies, and superior technology, those advantages evaporated. The contrast is stark. In England, Viking invasions destroyed all but one Anglo-Saxon kingdom by 880. The Carolingian Empire fared little better, its divisions leaving it vulnerable. Al-Andalus faced the same threat and defeated it in a single generation. The difference was organization, technology, and political will to transform a crisis into an opportunity. The fleet Abd ar-Rahman II built would endure for centuries, enabling control of the Straits of Gibraltar and dominance of Western Mediterranean trade. Some historians argue that Islamic naval supremacy over Christendom in the Western Mediterranean traces its origins to this defensive transformation. The Vikings learned their lesson. After 860, no major Norse incursion targeted Al-Andalus. When a fleet appeared off Lisbon in 966, it was repulsed without difficulty. When Caliph Al-Hakam II was warned of Norse ships in the 970s, he dispatched his army, and the Vikings simply fled. They had not forgotten what happened on the Guadalquivir. We are taught to think of Vikings as terrors of the medieval world, and so they were. But history is rarely simple. On the Guadalquivir in 844, the terror met its match. A civilization that refused to panic, a ruler who responded with vision, an army combining discipline with devastating technology. These proved sufficient to break the Viking tide. And so the narrative reverses. It was not the Vikings who terrorized the Muslims of Spain. It was Muslims who taught Vikings the meaning of defeat, and built, from that victory, a naval power that shaped the Mediterranean for centuries. Sometimes the dragon meets the flame, and the flame wins.